Okay, thank you, Lloyd. What I'm going to do now is begin. Let me just start by saying welcome to everybody for turning out to hear me give this talk. I appreciate it greatly. I'm deeply honored to have won this award. It really is humbling, and I profoundly appreciate it. The format today is rather unusual because I'm sort of in the room all by myself here, and I kind of have to introduce myself, which is rather bizarre. And I'm not going to do that because I'm assuming that everybody knows who I am, and I want to get right to the talk. I don't think we're going to have any logistical problems since we're on Zoom. I had a whole set of comments prepared had we been using the normal APSA platform, but of course we're not. So what I'll do is I'll talk and I'll just start my presentation as I would have if somebody were introducing me or had finished introducing me. And I'll talk for close to an hour. And I'm talking a little bit longer than I had originally intended because I have a lot to say. And I think it'll be easy to understand and hopefully people won't fall asleep. And then we can have a question and answer session. And I think what would be good is if everybody stayed on mute now while I'm talking. And then when we go to Q&A, I'll call people who raised their hand. I have the participants list on the right-hand side of my screen. And I will use that to call on people, and people can ask me questions and I'll do my best to answer. So let me just, without further ado, begin the lecture. I'm honored and humbled to receive the James Madison Award and to have the opportunity to deliver this lecture. I will use this occasion to examine the political crisis now facing the United States, with liberalism under siege while nationalism is on the rise. No recent event reflects this development better than Donald Trump's victory in 2016. Trump is an unabashed nationalist who explicitly rejects the unbounded liberalism that dominated American politics in the period between the end of the Cold War and his move into the White House. The present crisis of liberalism is especially surprising when one remembers how the Cold War ended 3 decades ago. It was widely believed at the time that liberalism was the unchallenged ideology in the United States. It was on the march, and nationalism was thought to be a spent force. This development was expected to have a transformative effect on countries all across the globe. There's no better statement of this liberal triumphalism than Francis Fukuyama's famous 1989 article, The End of History. Something has obviously gone wrong with that forecast, not just in the United States, but in other liberal democracies as well. By 2018, it was commonplace to read articles in mainstream Western publications talking about, quote unquote, the crisis of liberalism. My aim today is to assess why it is that liberalism is now in trouble while nationalism is on the march. I will focus primarily on the United States, but my analysis also applies to other liberal democracies which face much the same problem. The United States has been a liberal nation state throughout its history. The concept of a nation state is actually an embodiment of nationalism, which maintains that people with a powerful sense of collective identity should be allowed to govern themselves. Thus, to say that the United States is a liberal nation state is to say that its identity is deeply bound up with both liberalism and nationalism. Given the rich history of liberal nation states, it's obvious that liberalism and nationalism can coexist together. Nevertheless, there's a fundamental tension between these two ideologies, which can cause serious problems for a liberal nation state. Specifically, liberalism privileges the individual and is ultimately a universalistic ideology, while nationalism privileges the social group and is ultimately a particularistic ideology. This tension sometimes manifests itself in a clash between these two isms. In effect, there's a tug of war between liberalism and nationalism that shifts back and forth over time. My core claim is that when that balance shifts markedly in liberalism's favor, as it did in the wake of the Cold War, it threatens to undermine nationalism, which no country can do without. This development in turn triggers a nationalist backlash. In the ensuing conflict, nationalism wins almost every time because it is the most powerful political ideology on the planet. In Trump's victory in 2016, as well as Britain's vote to leave the European Union that same year, we call this, of course, Brexit, were largely the result of a clash between liberalism and nationalism that had been playing out beneath the surface in those two countries since at least 2000. This upsurge of nationalism has continued unabated since 2016. Let me now describe liberalism and nationalism and then explain how these two isms interact with each other. I will then apply that theoretical framework to the American case, focusing first on the golden age of unbounded liberalism and then on the nationalist backlash under President Trump. Liberalism privileges individualism. It assumes that we are at root free individuals who come together voluntarily to form a social contract, not social animals from the get-go. Furthermore, liberalism assumes that humans, despite their impressive reasoning skills, often disagree among themselves about first principles. In extreme cases, these disagreements are so intense that people want to kill those who disagree with them. Thus, a key task is to devise a political system that can maintain order while also respecting individual differences of opinion that are sometimes profound and potentially dangerous. The liberal solution to this problem has three parts. For starters, it emphasizes inalienable or natural rights. All individuals are said to be born with a set of rights that allows them to lead their life according to their own core principles. The second part of the formula is to purvey the norm of tolerance, to push individuals to adopt a live and let live approach towards those they disagree with about fundamental political and social issues. But norms have their limits, and thus some individuals will invariably try to deny others their legitimate rights and maybe even harm them. Thus, the third element of the liberal blueprint is to create a state that is powerful enough to protect individuals from each other and guarantee their rights, but not so powerful that it encroaches on those rights. In essence, the aim is to create a distinct boundary between the state and civil society, where individuals have as much freedom as possible in their personal lives. There's an important economic dimension to liberalism that grows naturally out of its conception of individual rights. Specifically, it is essential to create free markets in which individuals can pursue their own self-interest and realize their freedoms. The state may intervene at the edge of the market to prevent fraud or break up monopolies, for examples, but its primary mission is to defend property rights and break down internal and external barriers to exchange. The underlying belief is that individuals acting egoistically in the market ultimately benefits the entire society. Liberalism, it should be emphasized, has a powerful universalistic dimension baked into it, which strongly influences how liberal nation states think about the wider world. Because individual rights are inalienable and so important in the liberal story, liberal countries are primed to care about the rights of people all around the world. Of course, liberalism allows individuals to form large social groups that control their own state. Still, the rights of those individuals are privileged over any particular social characteristic that might inhere in any group. In effect, liberalism is both individualistic and universalistic at its core, which has profound consequences for how liberals think about important domestic and foreign policy issues. In contrast to liberalism, nationalism proceeds from the assumption that humans are fundamentally social animals, although they have room to carve out space for their individualism. Humans are born into and thrive in social groups that mold their identities and command their loyalties. The highest social group of real consequence in the modern world is the nation. Most individuals are deeply attached to their nation, which is not to deny that they can also be committed to other groups, such as their family. Nations need political institutions to help their members live together peacefully and prosperously. They need rules that define acceptable and unacceptable behavior and also stipulate how disputes will be settled. Nations also need political institutions to help shield them from other nations that might have an incentive to attack and possibly destroy them. Since the early 1500s, the dominant political form on the planet has been the state. Nations, therefore, want their own state because that is the best way to survive and prosper. At the same time, states have powerful administrative, economic, and military incentives to mold their inhabitants into nations if they hope to flourish and compete with other states in the international arena. Encouraging a profound sense of common identity and a shared destiny fosters unity and makes citizens willing to make sacrifices for the greater good. Thus, states need nations and nations need states. This symbiotic relationship has two consequences. First, the nation and state are tightly fused together in ways that cause most citizens to be deeply loyal to their nation state, even willing to fight and die for it. Second, the world is now populated almost exclusively by nation states, which reflects the remarkable influence of nationalism. Four features of nationalism are especially important for understanding its relationship to liberalism. To begin with, nations have a sense of oneness. Almost all its members feel like they are part of a common enterprise. They form what Benedict Anderson famously called an imagined community, even though no person knows more than a tiny fraction of the members. This is not to deny that there may be sharp economic and social inequalities within any nation, as well as a wide gap between the ruling elites and the broader public. The key point, however, is that the citizenry is tied together by a shared bond. There is a sense of what Anderson calls deep horizontal comradeship, which helps foster a powerful sense of national identity. Relatedly, each nation has a unique culture, which is to say it has a set of practices and beliefs that are widely shared among the citizenry. Those attributes not only distinguish it from other nations, but invariably give it a sense of superiority as well. There can be overlapping features between cultures. Both Iraqis and Saudis speak Arabic, while both Italy and Spain are Catholic countries. But when one looks at the overall package of traits that constitute different cultures, no two cultures are the same. In short, a nation's members tend to think and act alike in some important ways, which further promotes a sense of national identity. Another key feature of nationalism is the notion of sacred territory. Nations invariably form deep attachments with particular geographic spaces that they consider their homeland. That territory is an integral part of the nation's identity. Given the intrinsic value of that territory, preserving the borders that enclose a nation state and delineate it from the other are of enormous importance to the citizenry. These borders, of course, also help protect the nation state from foreign invasion, unwanted immigration, and undesirable foreign influence. Finally, there's the all-important matter of sovereignty. Nations aim to maximize their control over their own political fate. They care greatly about self-determination, which means they are concerned about how political authority is arranged inside their own nation state, as well as with other nation states. Regarding the international dimension, sovereignty means that nation states want to be free from outside interference to make their own decisions to the extent they can, both with regard to domestic and foreign policy. Nevertheless, states can delegate the authority to make certain decisions to international institutions without surrendering supreme authority, which is the essence of sovereignty. Still, even this limited relationship will rankle some nationalists who think that any delegation of authority infringes on their nation state's sovereignty. Liberalism and nationalism were obviously distinct ideologies. The individualism at liberalism's core, coupled with its emphasis on inalienable rights, makes it a universalistic ideology. Nationalism, in contrast, stresses the importance of the group over the individual and is particularistic all the way down. Still, these two isms are often compatible, as the American experience, among others, makes manifestly clear. Moreover, liberalism and nationalism worked in tandem throughout the late 19th and early 20th centuries to help bring down dynastic rulers in Europe. Some scholars even argue that these two isms can be fused together to produce what Yael Tamir calls liberal nationalism. This fruitful coexistence is not the whole story, however. There is also a conflictual side to the relationship. Liberalism has the potential to weaken nationalism, which is tantamount to threatening the nation state itself. This threat becomes real when liberalism is fully unleashed, when its proponents are filled with self-confidence and advance an ambitious agenda that minimizes nationalism's role. Let's call such a campaign unbounded liberalism. When liberalism takes this form, a nationalist backlash is sure to occur. What makes unbounded liberalism so dangerous to nationalism is its potential to weaken national identity. That is, the powerful inclination for individuals to closely identify with their nation. This development, in turn, leads to a weakening of social cohesion, or what might be called national solidarity. In effect, as national identity declines among the citizenry, the all-important bonds that hold a nation together begin to fray. How does this happen? For starters, the extreme individualism at the core of liberalism cuts against the notion that each citizen is ultimately part of a coherent and vibrant community that has a powerful claim on one's loyalty. According to nationalist logic, what's good for the overall nation matters greatly for each of its members. Individualism, however, undermines the sense of oneness that is at the core of nationalism, as individuals tend to see themselves primarily as egoistic utility maximizers. Furthermore, the universalism that is built into liberalism, and I want to be clear here, what we were talking about before was the individualism. Now I'm switching gears and talking about the universalism. Furthermore, the universalism that is built into liberalism calls for treating people all across the world as rights-bearing equals. While the belief that we are first and foremost members of a global community has a certain appeal, it's at odds with nationalism because it challenges the idea that a person is part of a distinct nation with a rich culture and a deep history. As Benedict Anderson notes, no nation imagines itself coterminous with mankind. To be more specific, the universalistic impulse undermines national identity and national solidarity in three distinct ways. First, emphasizing that we are part of a common humanity is likely to promote sympathy, if not enthusiasm, for open-ended immigration and a permissive policy towards refugees. Second, that same universalism facilitates the emergence of a global elite tied together by shared economic interests and social networks, and with its own identity as citizens of the world. Its members and their children will often attend the same schools, which brings us to universalism's third distinct consequence. Universities will recruit large numbers of students from abroad and treat them much the way they treat citizen students. Those schools will increasingly be seen as international, not national institutions. This erosion of national solidarity is of enormous importance because nationalism is like glue, which helps hold the society together. Remember, liberalism is predicated on the recognition that individuals, even individuals within the same nation state, often disagree about first principles, and those differences can be so intense that they sometimes lead to violence. By emphasizing oneness and deep loyalty to the group, nationalism goes a long way toward binding together people with disparate views on controversial issues. Take away that group solidarity, and it becomes increasingly difficult to control the divisive forces found in every country around the world. Not only does unbounded liberalism eat away at the nation, it also weakens the state, which is the other essential ingredient in nationalism. Liberalism challenges the nationalist vision of a state as a hard shell encompassing a nation and its sacred territory. Borders are porous, maybe even open because of liberal thinking about immigration and refugee flows. Liberal precepts make it difficult to think in terms of keeping the other out. Moreover, liberalism's emphasis on creating an open international economy further contributes to weakening state borders. At the same time, the notion of sacred territory belonging to a particular nation is at odds with the universalistic ideology that downplays national differences from the get-go. There are two other institutions associated with liberalism's economic side that directly challenge and weaken the state. The first is the market, which is considered a more efficient regulator of economic and social life than the state. For almost all liberals, markets know best. In fact, too much state intervention can undermine markets, which effectively means that a constrained state is a good state. Liberalism also stresses the importance of international institutions, which play a crucial role in managing the open international economy. Those institutions, however, invariably assume responsibilities that allow them to handcuff states in important ways. In essence, Unbounded liberalism's assault on the concept of a cohesive, hard-shell state, coupled with its emphasis on the virtues of markets and international institutions, undermines the notion of a powerful sovereign state that can meet the nation's needs. That development, in turn, encourages citizens to lose faith in the state. Thus, liberalism on steroids works to weaken the tight bond between the nation and the state, which is the crux of nationalism. When liberalism is on the march and nationalism is under siege, a nationalist backlash eventually follows. The ensuing competition between these two perspectives is not a fair fight. Nationalism wins every time. Not only does liberalism fail to achieve its most ambitious goals, but many of its most important gains are likely to be reversed. Indeed, the great danger is that a resurgent nationalism will not merely restore a workable balance of power between liberalism and nationalism, but will instead turn liberal democracies into illiberal democracies or worse. Nationalism is more powerful than liberalism for three reasons. First, nationalism is more in sync with human nature. Humans are intensely social beings from the beginning, not individuals who start life alone and form social contracts when they are mature. We are all born into social groups that nurture us and protect us. Nations, like other social groups, are primarily survival vehicles that are essential for our well-being. Their common culture allows members to cooperate more easily and effectively, which in turn maximizes their chances of securing the basic necessities of life. Second, liberalism alone cannot provide the glue that holds disputatious people together in a state, which is a monumental task, as we all know. The liberal solution for the problem, promoting the norm of tolerance and creating a state that is largely confined to maintaining order and protecting rights, is helpful. It is helpful, but not enough to handle those rancorous differences. Nationalism is essential for accomplishing that difficult task because it provides a common culture that helps create bonds between people who often have profound differences over first principles. In brief, liberalism needs nationalism, but nationalism does not need liberalism. Third, nationalism, unlike liberalism, fulfills important emotional needs. One characteristic of a nation state that makes it so special is that it provides its members with an existential narrative. It gives them a strong sense that they are part of an exclusive and exceptional community whose history is filled with important traditions as well as remarkable people and remarkable events. Furthermore, nationalism promises people that the nation will be there for future generations the way it was there for past generations. In this sense, nationalism is much like religion, which is also adept at weaving the past, present, and future into a seamless web that gives members the sense that they are part of a long and rich tradition. This formidable bonding is absent from liberalism, which has no equivalent story to tell. Finally, the evidence shows that nationalism is the more powerful of the two ideologies. For example, the international system is populated almost completely with nation states, which again is the embodiment of nationalism. Of course, there are many liberal democracies as well, but they have never numbered even half of the countries in the world, and ultimately each of them is a liberal nation state. Moreover, as Benedict Anderson notes, every successful revolution has defined itself in national terms. Regarding communism, it did battle with nationalism throughout much of the 20th century in countries like Czechoslovakia, the Soviet Union, and Yugoslavia. and nationalism won every time. The bottom line is that liberalism can coexist with nationalism, but when it gets overly assertive, it's sure to prompt a nationalist backlash. That reaction, in turn, will cause a serious problem for liberalism, at least in the short term. Let me now shift gears and show how these ideas can help us understand what has happened in the United States over the past 3 decades. The 25 years or so after the Cold War are often referred to as the unipolar moment, but they could also be called the liberal moment. Never in history has liberalism been a more powerful force than it was during this period. The balance of power between liberalism and nationalism in countries like Britain and the United States shifted sharply in liberalism's favor. Indeed, many in the West thought that nationalism was a spent force and had no future. It appeared to some globalists, Jill Lepore writes, that nationalism had died. Western elites, of course, welcomed this prospect, as almost all of them viewed nationalism as a malign force and that not only threatened liberalism, but also was a major cause of war, including the 2 world wars. Western academics especially disliked nationalism, in part because modern universities are fundamentally liberal institutions that are threatened by the particularism and conformity that nationalist thinking promotes. Given this disdain for nationalism, Western elites embraced a remarkably ambitious set of liberal policies in the aftermath of the Cold War. In fact, this unbounded liberalism actually began gaining traction in the United States as well as Britain during the 1980s. President Ronald Reagan and Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, who were both nationalists, were also deeply committed to pursuing a quote-unquote neoliberal economic agenda that was widely seen as a fundamental challenge to the economic orthodoxies of the day. Specifically, they pushed policies that promoted individualism and the virtues of unrestrained markets while criticizing big government. Reagan said in his first inaugural address that, quote, "In this present crisis, government is not the solution to our problems, government is the problem." Instead, he championed markets, and to quote the author of a recent history of economic ideas, Reagan was the poet laureate of this new emphasis on individualism. Thatcher's privileging of the individual over society, as well as her skepticism about what the state can do to help people, are captured in her famous comment in a 1987 interview. Quote, "I think we have been through a period when too many people have been given to understand that when they have a problem, it is government's job to cope with it. They are casting their problems on society. And you know, there is no such thing as society. There are individual men and women, and there are families, and no government can do anything except through people, and people must look to themselves first," end of quote. Reagan and Thatcher's neoliberal agenda was given a powerful boost by the triumphalism that took hold in the West after the Cold War. Then in the mid-1990s, neoliberalism took hold in the Democratic Party with Bill Clinton's New Democrats initiative and the Labour Party in Britain with Tony Blair's Third Way initiative. For example, Clinton announced his intention in early 1995 to, quote, "shift resources and decision-making from bureaucrats to citizens, injecting choice and competition and individual responsibility into national policy." A year later, he announced that the era of big government is over. By the mid-1990s, both the left and right sides of the political spectrum in these two paradigmatic liberal countries embraced a thoroughly liberal agenda based on smaller government and free markets. Unsurprisingly, Alan Greenspan boasted in 2007, "It hardly makes any difference who will be the next president. The world is governed by market forces." How did the central feature of what I call unbounded liberalism weaken American nationalism during the liberal moment? Two of the key elements in the story, individualism and unrestrained markets, have already been mentioned, but some more elaboration is required. The emphasis on individualism, which is the central feature of liberal ideology, encourages people to maximize their own utility and not worry about the welfare of others. The claim that egoistic behavior ultimately benefits the entire society justifies this selfish behavior. It produces a rising tide that lifts all boats, so the story goes. Thinking and acting in purely self-regarding ways, however, clashes with the notion that individuals are part of a larger collective held together by strong social bonds. In short, this radical individualism is like an acid that corrodes national solidarity and the sense of oneness that lies at the core of nationalism. Relatedly, unbounded liberalism emphasized that the best way to regulate economic life is to privilege the market over the state. Markets that allow individuals to maximize their utility were considered highly efficient, while the modern state, with its enormous power to intervene in society's daily life, was seen as an impediment to efficiency and growth, even freedom itself. This line of thinking strikes at the core of nationalism, not just by undermining the state's legitimacy, but also by weakening the bonds between the nation and the state. After all, the claim that citizens cannot rely on the state to serve their best interests is sure to undermine their loyalty to that important institution. While these two key elements of unbounded liberalism are commonly associated with economic policies that fall under the rubric of neoliberalism, their influence has implications for all aspects of life. As Wendy Brown notes, neoliberalism is more than just a set of economic policies. It is a widely and deeply disseminated governing rationality that transmogrifies every human domain and endeavor, along with humans themselves, according to a specific image of the economic. Another distinguishing feature of liberalism is its universalism, which was clearly reflected in the American elite's thinking about immigration, refugees, and borders. Specifically, the core belief that all individuals are members of a global community made it difficult to put meaningful limits on immigration. After all, liberalism has no place for distinguishing between cultures and nations, much less privileging one's own group over another on those grounds. Thus, unbounded liberalism tended to favor not just open-ended immigration, but also was tolerant toward illegal immigration. Jill Lepore, for example, maintains that anyone who accepts the American creed belongs in this country. Liberal elites also favored generous policies regarding refugees. Given this open arms policy toward immigration and refugees, it's unsurprising that the notion of a hard shell state that fenced off sacred national territory came under attack during the liberal moment. The emphasis among elites was instead on maintaining porous, if not open borders. The starkest manifestation of this perspective is the Schengen Agreement, which effectively created a borderless world inside liberal Europe. The president of the European Commission went so far as to say, borders are the worst invention ever. Liberal thinking about immigration and borders cut against nationalism in profound ways. It directly challenges the notion of national identity. To be clear, and I want to be very clear here, nationalism does not preclude immigration, even large-scale immigration. Indeed, the United States has benefited enormously from the huge number of immigrants that have landed on its shores over time, my distant relatives included, and many of yours as well. But that flow of newcomers must be firmly controlled and designed to help maintain a robust American nation. Immigration in a liberal world, however, is based on the belief that we are above all else citizens of the world. Thus, Americans should have a relaxed view toward immigration and treat them as fellow members of a global society, not as foreigners seeking to join their nation. Relatedly, unbounded liberalism takes dead aim at the core national belief that states are sovereign entities that have the authority and responsibility to strictly control their borders so as to maintain the integrity of the nation and protect its sacred territory. Unbounded liberalism has yet another dimension, this one more economic than political. And this, too, of course, helped undermine the hard shell notion of the state and push toward a borderless world. After the Cold War, American elites worked assiduously to create a wide open international economy that maximized free trade and fostered unfettered capital markets. This hyper-globalized world economy, which was more ambitious in scope than the economic order that prevailed in the West during the Cold War, helped to break down or weaken many of the existing barriers between countries and sought to weave them together into a seamless economic order. This new economic order had two other effects that worked to undermine nationalism. It helped cultivate a powerful international or transnational elite whose members tend to have more in common with each other than their fellow nationals, while also damaging the economic fortunes of many of the latter. This combination of results pointed a dagger at the heart of nationalism. Hyperglobalization expanded contacts between elites of all kinds, business, intellectual, media, and policy. And of course, we're talking here about elites from all over the world. Those elites did not abandon their national identities, but they acquired a powerful cosmopolitan or transnational identity as well. They spoke English, often went to the same schools, read the same publications, and were committed to neoliberal economic policies. This new identity, however, worked to put distance between Western elites and their fellow citizens, which naturally weakened the nation. Former Prime Minister Theresa May captured this phenomenon in 2015 when she said, and I'm quoting Theresa May here, "Today, too many people in positions of power behave as though they have more in common with international elites than with people down the road, the people they employ, the people they pass in the street. But if you believe you're a citizen of the world, you're a citizen of nowhere. You don't understand what the very word citizenship means." Moreover, those transnational elites and elites more generally became increasingly wealthy while many of their fellow citizens struggled. As countless studies have shown, the economic policies that underpinned hyperglobalization have greatly benefited a narrow slice of the American public, not only creating staggering inequality, but also damaging the economic fortunes of massive numbers of lower class and middle class workers. The resulting human despair is so acute that life expectancy in the United States decreased between 2014 and 2017. Let me repeat that. Life expectancy in the United States decreased between 2014 and 2017. These economic and social consequences of hyperglobalization eat away at the American nation by fueling the belief that the globalized elite that runs the United States has abandoned the average citizen in pursuit of its own narrow interests. In short, hyperglobalization threatened the sense of oneness that is the essence of the modern nation state. There's another dimension to unbounded liberalism that relates to the open international economy. To make that system work effectively, liberal elites in the United States and other Western countries increased the power of international institutions. For example, the WTO, the World Trade Organization, which was created in 1995 to manage international trade, was markedly more powerful than the GATT, the institution it replaced. Although countries did not surrender sovereignty to these international bodies, that was not the public perception. Thus, international institutions were seen as instruments for weakening sovereignty, one of nationalism's core elements. Furthermore, the rules these institutions promulgate constrain countries, even the mighty United States, by limiting their ability to protect their citizens from economic harm. Given all the creative destruction that comes with hyperglobalization, these limits invariably weaken the bond between nation and state, which strikes at the heart of nationalism. American universities played their own role in undermining nationalism. The vast majority of these universities are profoundly liberal institutions in the best sense of that term, and they increasingly see themselves as international or transnational institutions. They welcome people from all over the world, in part because non-nationals provide diversity to the faculty and the student body, but also because university leaders believe, as a former Yale dean put it, quote, "If we want to train the next generation of global leaders, we better have the globe here," end of quote. Furthermore, this openness makes financial sense, and it brings some of the best and the brightest from around the world to US universities. Once they arrive, of course, foreigners on university campuses are typically treated no differently from their American counterparts. After all, the main criterion for assessing individuals in academia is how smart and capable they are relative to their peers, not their nationality. This extreme open-mindedness, which is at odds with nationalism, naturally helped create and nurture the transnational elite. Universities undercut nationalism in yet another way. They are deeply committed to truth-telling, which means their historians and social scientists are going to produce scholarship that undermines the founding myths that are an essential ingredient of American or any other nationalism. The resulting tension between the scholarly enterprise and nationalism causes many academics to intensely dislike nationalism. This sentiment is reflected in Jill Lepore's comment that hatred for nationalism, I want to quote that again, hatred for nationalism drove historians away from it in the second half of the 20th century. Hatred for nationalism, of course, extends far beyond history departments in the academy. Finally, a word is in order about identity politics, which is closely linked to universities, but certainly not restricted to them. Mark Lilla sees this movement as a critically important dimension of unbounded liberalism. He maintains that this, and he calls it identity liberalism, is based on radical individualism, that again is his words, and is effectively, to quote him, Reaganism for lefties. So he's saying identity politics is basically Reaganism for lefties. Well, there's no question that identity politics focuses on individual identity and individual rights. It also devotes considerable attention to how marginalized groups can gain equal recognition and treatment from their surrounding society. Given the attention paid to groups, it is hard to argue that identity politics is a straightforward liberal phenomenon. Identity politics is actually a compelling illustration of the extent to which citizens often disagree among themselves, sometimes bitterly, about first principles. Those disputes in turn show why nationalism is needed as a glue that can help those citizens, can help hold those citizens together in a functioning society. Yet most people who engage in identity politics are openly hostile to nationalism and focus instead on promoting their own as well as their group's interests in the face of stiff resistance from other groups. This notion of separateness is obviously at odds with the sense of oneness that is the essence of nationalism. These different dimensions of unbounded liberalism were remarkably influential in the American body politic during the initial 25 years after the Cold War. Unsurprisingly, Western elites tended to think that nationalism hardly mattered inside the United States or other liberal democracies. Although nationalist political parties were gaining strength in Europe by 2015, still, there was no sense among the liberal elites that nationalism was a powerful force to be reckoned with, and that liberalism would soon find itself mired in a crisis. That situation changed abruptly in 2016. Two seismic events struck at the heart of the liberal enterprise that year: Brexit and the election of Donald Trump. What made these events so remarkable is that they occurred in the two paradigmatic liberal democracies. The outcome in both cases was caused in large part by resurgent nationalism. In essence, the events of 2016 were the result of a conflict between liberalism and nationalism that had been imperceptibly at play since at least 2000. To be clear, nationalism did not go away during liberalism's golden moment, although the balance between those two isms surely shifted in liberalism's favor. The most obvious evidence of nationalism at play was the breakups of Czechoslovakia, the Soviet Union, and Yugoslavia, which occurred because different national groups within those countries wanted their own nation state. There were also national groups in Western Europe, like the Catalonians in Spain and the Scots in Great Britain, who threatened to break away from their own nation state. There were other telltale signs of nationalism's staying power as well. Secretary of State Madeleine Albright, a deeply committed liberal, was asked in 1998 why the United States was contemplating using military force against Iraq. She replied, "If we have to use force, it is because we are America. We are the indispensable nation." Hear that word? We are the indispensable nation. We stand taller and we see further than other countries into the future. And we see the danger here to all of us. Note, of course, that she refers to the American nation, and then she makes the case for American exceptionalism. Albright's comment is dyed-in-the-wool American exceptionalism, which is precisely the kind of chauvinism that underpins nationalism. Note also that the European Union, the most ambitious liberal institution ever built, has not transcended nationalism. When citizens of the member states are asked what their primary identity is, invariably less than 5% say they view themselves as Europeans only. The overwhelming majority view themselves according to their nationality alone or primarily their nationality. Although nationalism did not disappear during the liberal moment, unbounded liberalism threatened it in significant ways. Given that nationalism is the more powerful of these two ideologies, it was only a matter of time before there was a nationalist backlash, and the tug of war between those competing isms shifted back toward nationalism. That shift happened in the United States with Donald Trump's election. He won the White House for a number of reasons, but one of his key assets is that he ran as a nationalist against both Democrats and Republicans who embraced unbounded liberalism. Moreover, Trump has governed as a nationalist and continues to challenge unbounded liberalism at every turn. One can question his competence as president, and I would be among the first to do so, but there is no question that he has pursued a nationalist agenda from the beginning of his political career, and that it helped propel him into the White House. His rivals, on the other hand, especially Hillary Clinton during the 2016 election, recoil at his nationalist rhetoric and continue to embrace unbounded liberalism. A close examination of Trump's commitment to nationalism provides stark evidence of the nationalist backlash against unbounded liberalism. Indeed, he openly described himself as, quote, a total nationalist in February 2017. He re-emphasized that point in a controversial speech in Houston in October 2018, and then he told reporters the following day, I am absolutely a nationalist, and I am proud of it. Trump also placed heavy emphasis, especially in his inaugural address, on the theme that the United States is, quote unquote, one nation. For too long, he said, a small group has reaped the rewards of government, while the people have borne the cost. Moreover, quote, the establishment protected itself, but not the citizens of our country. That situation was about to change, he stressed, as, quote, a nation exists to serve its citizens. Trump also frequently talks about the importance of sovereignty, one of nationalism's core concepts. Quoting him now before the United Nations in September 2017, there can be no substitute for strong, sovereign, and independent nations. That speech is filled with references to the virtues of sovereignty. In foreign affairs, he maintained, we are renewing this founding principle of sovereignty. Relatedly, Trump has made it clear since he started campaigning for the presidency that he was committed to putting America's interests first. From this moment on, he said in his inaugural address, it is going to be America first. Unlike his recent predecessors, Trump never extols the virtues of the quote unquote international community. Trump also praises American culture, although not in a chauvinistic way. Indeed, he made it clear before the United Nations in September 2019 that he believes it is good that the world is populated with sovereign states with different cultures. Like my beloved country, each nation represented in this hall has a cherished history, culture, and heritage that is worth defending and celebrating, and which gives us our singular potential and strength. The free world must embrace its national foundations. It must not attempt to erase them or replace them. He went on to say, quote, wise leaders always put the good of their own people and their own country first. The future does not belong to globalists. The future belongs to patriots. The future belongs to sovereign and independent nations who protect their citizens, respect their neighbors, and honor the differences that make each country special and unique. Trump's nationalism is also reflected in his views on immigration, refugees, and especially borders. For example, he made it clear to the UN in 2018 that his administration was working hard, quote, to confront threats to sovereignty from uncontrolled migration, especially illegal migration. A year earlier, in the same venue, he emphasized that although he was not opposed to accepting refugees, he wanted an approach that limited their numbers and, quote, which enables their eventual return to their home countries, end of quote. Relatedly, he has frequently highlighted his intention of maintaining tight control over America's borders. I have a message, he told the UN in 2019, for those open border activists who cloak themselves in the rhetoric of social justice. Your policies are not just. Your policies are cruel and evil. The media and universities are also frequent targets of Trump's wrath. In July 2020, for example, he sent out a tweet stating, "Too many universities and school systems are about radical left indoctrination, not education. Therefore, I am telling the Treasury Department to re-examine their exempt status." Moreover, he recently tried, but failed, to force foreign students to leave the country if their universities taught all their courses online. Plus, he has put limits on Chinese graduate students entering the United States. Trump's hatred of the liberal media, quote unquote, which he frequently describes as, quote, an enemy of the people, is constantly on display. Finally, Trump consistently rails against the open international economy and international institutions, or what he more generally refers to as globalism. He maintained that, quote, globalism exerted a religious pull over past leaders, causing them to ignore their own national interests. In particular, quote, the United States opened its economy with few conditions, and other countries took advantage of that openness. He heaped scorn on, quote unquote, global bureaucrats for, quote, attacking the sovereignty of nations. And he has declared, quote, we will never surrender America's sovereignty to an unelected, unaccountable global bureaucracy. America is governed by Americans. We reject the ideology of globalism, and we embrace the doctrine of patriotism. Although Trump has benefited politically from nationalism's resurgence, he did not cause it. His election was the manifestation of a process that was well underway by 2016. Indeed, unbounded liberalism's troubles were on full display by that point. Remember that Senator Bernie Sanders, a self-declared socialist, almost beat Hillary Clinton, a staunch defender of unbounded liberalism, in the Democratic primaries. One could even see glimpses of nationalist thinking in Barack Obama's rhetoric before 2016. He famously advocated doing, quote unquote, nation building at home, and his emphasis on creating a unified nation in his second inaugural address is remarkably similar to what Trump would say 4 years later. Obama actually made it clear throughout his speech that liberalism requires a vibrant nationalism to flourish. As President Obama said in 2013, this is in his second inaugural address, preserving our individual freedoms ultimately requires collective action. For the American people can no more meet the demands of today's world by acting alone than American soldiers could have met the forces of fascism or communism with muskets and militias. Now more than ever, we must do these things together as one nation and one people. In recent years, most Democrats have been unable to bring themselves to embrace nationalism in any meaningful way. Hillary Clinton, for example, could not bring herself to counter Trump's America First rhetoric during the 2016 campaign by stressing that she would, of course, put America's interests first as the President of the United States. When Ambassador Michael McFaul, a deeply committed liberal in the Obama administration, was asked about Trump's self-identification as a nationalist, he replied, "Does Trump know the historical baggage associated with this word, or is he ignorant?" As Jill Lepore notes, Democrats have, quote, gotten skittish about the word nation, as if to fear that use it means descending into nationalism. This antipathy towards nationalism is a huge liability for Democrats. In effect, they are handcuffing themselves and allowing the Republicans to use this powerful political weapon against them. If Joe Biden wants to be president, he would be well advised to make sure that his own nationalist bona fides are crystal clear to voters. In conclusion, the unbounded liberalism that dominated the political landscape in the US after the Cold War is in serious crisis, mainly because it threatened American nationalism, which has reasserted itself under President Trump. Even so, liberalism per se is not about to disappear in the United States. As Lewis Hartz famously argued a long time ago, the roots of the liberal tradition run deep in America. Liberal democracy also has many virtues. I am forever grateful that I was born and raised in liberal America and teach at a thoroughly liberal university. Moreover, liberalism has a crucial role to play in taming nationalism's dark side. Specifically, liberalism's emphasis on individual rights and tolerance, coupled with its universal impulse, goes a long way toward countering nationalism's dangerous and ever-present potential for demonizing the other and dealing with it harshly or even brutally. Although liberalism is here to stay, the United States will continue to be a liberal nation state, not just the liberal state. Nationalism remains the world's most formidable political ideology, and neither it nor the nation state is going away anytime soon. Indeed, the challenges posed to the United States by the rise of China and COVID-19 are likely to reinforce American nationalism, as external dangers typically do. Although liberalism and nationalism will always have an uneasy coexistence, nationalism's staying power is ultimately good news for liberalism, because liberalism alone cannot deal with the disruptive forces that inevitably tear at the fabric of liberal societies. Nationalism is still needed to help provide that glue. Thank you. I will now take questions, and I'll do my best to get as many in as possible. The first comes from John Sullivan. And John, I think you have to turn your microphone on. And
I have, yes. Can you hear me now?
I can hear you clearly, and I assume everybody else can hear you.
Well, thank you very much for your presentation. I spent many years working with the National Endowment for Democracy and the Center for International Private Enterprise, which is one of the core institutes. Your fascinating presentation. I couldn't help but wonder if you see a relationship between the challenges to democracy and democratic traditions, not just in the US, but worldwide, and the rise of nationalism and the weakening of liberalism.
Fascinating question. I mentioned Wendy Brown's book, or I quoted from Wendy Brown's book, and I read a large number of other books dealing with the crisis of liberalism, including Patrick Deneen's book. And Deneen, of course, is on the right, and Wendy Brown's more on the left. And what was clear in a great deal of the literature that I read was that many people see the existing crisis today as one between liberalism and democracy. And I am making the argument that this is not a conflict between liberalism and democracy. it's a conflict between liberalism and nationalism. And the main reason I did not address this in my talk, this distinction, was because of space and time. As you know, I already spoke for an inordinately long time. But there's no question that there are a lot of people, and this includes people like Wendy Brown on the left and Patrick Deneen more on the right, who see the present crisis as one between liberalism and democracy. I actually don't think there is a great problem with democracy in the United States today. I don't think the problem is all about democracy. And I actually believe if I could spend an hour talking about those two books and a handful of other books that posit this problem as one between liberalism and democracy, I could show you that much of the rhetoric in those books is really about the fight between liberalism and nationalism, not liberalism and democracy. So I don't think we have a serious problem with democracy in America today. I think there is a bit of a problem for sure. I don't want to say there's no problem, but the main reason that I steered away from that was because I think that the problem here is really all about nationalism and liberalism. And I think what happens here is that most people are very reluctant in the academy, in the intellectual world, to talk about nationalism as a powerful force for good. And that is the argument that I'm making. I fully understand that nationalism has a dark side. And I said at the end of my talk that I think one of the great virtues of liberalism is that it does work in important ways to counter that dark side. But the fact is that liberalism is here to stay, and it does have a positive side. It's just absolutely essential for making a modern society work. And I think that what we've had here since the end of the Cold War is this real conflict between nationalism and liberalism. And I don't see the problem as mainly democracy versus liberalism.
I was actually asking whether you see a problem between nationalism and democracy. For instance, Viktor Orban, the Polish leadership, what we see happening in the Middle East and other countries, where it seems like the rise, democratic freedoms are being constrained very significantly by the rise of these populist nationalist leaders.
Well, I don't see any problem there. I mean, if you want to think about Viktor Orban argues that what he is purveying today is illiberal democracy. So Orban is not saying we don't have democracy. He's saying we don't have liberalism, right? So you have a great deal of nationalism built into Orban's policy prescriptions. There's no question about that. But he views this as democratic, right? People vote. There's not a problem there. The problem is not democracy. The problem is liberalism. It's the fact that it's illiberal democracy. So I don't see a problem there. And to sort of unpack this at a more theoretical level, one of the points that I made in the talk is that if you think about what the key characteristics of nationalism are, one of them is sovereignty or self-determination. Nationalism is really all about self-determination, but self-determination really morphs very easily into democracy. There is not a complete overlap by any means between nationalism and democracy, but they are in certain ways kissing cousins. So I don't see a real tension there. And I think it's not reflected in Orban and most other places around the world. I think the real problem in places like Hungary, Poland, even Czechoslovakia now, lots of other places around the world, is that liberalism is threatened, not democracy. The great danger is in those countries that you'll get illiberal democracy.
Professor Mearsheimer, this
Yes.
is Parag Hoon here in Olympia, Washington, and thank you for your talk. I really appreciate you bringing us back to nationalism. I commute, so I heard Jill Lepore's narrative about nationalism. And since I also work in Africa, I really appreciate you bringing us back to thinking about the nation state in a foundational way in American politics or in this moment. And so the question I have for you is, the sort of distinction we make between ethnic nationalism and a version of that, which is what we call in the United States, white nationalism, which is being articulated by, let's say, Donald Trump. And what your critique really of Hillary Clinton is her overemphasis of what you point to is a neoliberal sort of version of internationalism, rather than paying due attention to the kind of nationalism that's we see in specifically being deployed by Donald Trump. So I guess I'd really appreciate you highlighting the survival in the future of both the Democratic Party and of this, of I guess our nation, is what the nation means, right? So what I would like us to sort of reflect is what the nationalism that you're assuming is a certain kind of ethnic nationalism. So how does what Jill Lepore really evokes is to rethink what that means, not only for historians, but also for political scientists. Well, how should we deploy or redeploy cosmopolitan nationalism from, which sort of speaks to Donald Trump's version of ethnic nationalism?
Well, I want to be very clear. I don't view American nationalism as ethnic nationalism. I think it's cultural. I think that the United States has a particular culture that's based on a set of practices and beliefs that are commonly shared. So I would not make the argument that nationalism here is based on ethnicity. And furthermore, I have no use whatsoever for white nationalism, which is a form, I guess, of ethnic nationalism. I think there's no question that Trump occasionally flirts with white nationalism because he thinks it works to his political advantage. I think that white nationalism is antithetical to nationalism in the sense that I'm talking about it. My argument is that we are all, everybody who's an American is part of this nation, and that we have a deep-seated interest in having a healthy nationalism. And white nationalism is not healthy nationalism. White nationalism is pure poison. And Trump's making a huge mistake in purveying that kind of thinking. In fact, one could argue, I don't want to get off on this, one could argue that, Trump, despite the fact he has been very successful at playing the nationalism card, he's done more to divide us than unify us. And if you really do believe that we are, one people, and that we have to have some sense of oneness, is not to deny you can carve out room for your individualism, but we do have to have this sense of oneness that he's done a lot to damage that. But again, I'm talking about culture here in the American case, not about ethnicity. And I think, by the way, that's one of America's great strengths. And I tried to make this point with regard to immigration. The United States is an immigrant culture. It's what's made the United States great. We have, over time, brought in huge numbers of immigrants. They have become Americans, fully functioning members of the society, of the nation, and that's a wonderful thing. And I believe, by the way, in the future, we're going to have to open the sluice gates and bring in more and more people. Immigration is in our future. And I again, think that's a wonderful thing. My point is that if immigrants come into the United States, it's very important that they be molded into or incorporated into this nation, this viable national entity, or this nation state, because that's essential for surviving in the international system. If you have an America that's not a nation state, it's going to fall apart. Because again, my point is liberalism is not by itself enough to hold the nation state together.
Thank you. Thank you for that response.
You're welcome. I don't see any other hands, but let me just see here if there's, if anybody wants to jump in and say anything, don't hesitate.
Will you be giving us a copy of your presentation?
Yeah. the way this works is that it will be published pretty much as is in PS relatively soon. I think maybe in January or February, because as I told the editor of PS, I would give him a copy of my talk, which I would have really good shape right after the talk. So maybe tomorrow I'll ship the editor of PS a copy of the talk. I even have footnotes in it, and it will be published, I think he said to me, early next year. The way it works, just for your information, is that the president of the APSA, she gives a speech, and her speech is published in Perspectives on Politics. And the winner of the James Madison Award, his or her talk, is published in PS. So this will be published in PS. But for anybody who wants a copy of the talk, just send me an email, and it would be no problem for me to respond and send it back to you. Okay, if there are no more questions, somebody has a hand up. Is it Selena? No, there are actually a couple hands up. Kamal Sadiq. Make sure you turn, everybody should make sure when they talk that they turn their volume on, or their audio on.
I had a question on whether globally unbounded liberalism is an urban phenomenon. So there's an urban-rural divide, and where nationalism is in rural areas more, and urban areas is where you'll see unbounded liberalism. And perhaps that's not as much the case in the United States, but in many parts of the world, the cosmopolitan, hyper-globalization, the kind of elite you're talking about, resides in urban centers. And I wanted to hear your response to that.
Well, I'll make 2 points, then throw the ball back to you, Kamal. The first point is, I've never thought of it in those terms. I mean, I think the way I've thought about it, and most people think about it, is in terms of different states. You know, is this state liberal or is it not? Mm-hmm. But it's a very interesting way of thinking about it. And I would say off the top of my head that I think in almost every country on the planet, you're going to find much more sympathy for unbounded liberalism, even for neoliberal economics in cities. And you're going to find a lot more emphasis on nationalism in the countryside or in rural areas. And I think that's true in the United States. I mean, I've never studied this carefully, but again, off the top of my head, I would assume it's true in most other countries around the world as well. I think one could argue that urbanization over time has played to the advantage of, liberalism in good ways. You want to comment on that?
Yeah, well, I would say that poses interesting question, that if you have increasing urbanization, you might lead to more conflicts between liberalism and nationalism than if you didn't. So a highly rural agricultural society, which is mostly rural, might comfortably sit with liberalism because liberalism has a small seat. It's very small. There are the constituency of cosmopolitan elites is confined to 1 or 2 big cities. That's it. And so there's a much more of a consensus. But as these countries develop, perhaps you get more conflict between liberalism and nationalism as urbanization increases.
It's a very interesting argument. And it certainly sounds plausible. But again, I've not studied it. Yeah.
Thank you.
John, sorry to, what Kamal was saying and what you said about rural urban and the role of universities. I mean, I and Kamal are representative of that phenomenon of unbound liberalism. Both of us were at a college in a liberal university in India and are here in the United States at tenured faculty, as you said. So part of what you're seeing is this rural urban division and across and the transnational linkages. So the sort of backlash is coming from not necessarily rural areas, but people who get left behind in this uneven space. So my example would be the nodes I see around where I am in Seattle and the areas, the hinterlands, the rural areas are not necessarily just Eastern Washington, but it's people who are also commuting, so forth, 3 hours and 4 hours, or where Kamal is in San Francisco and so forth, or where you are. So I guess what I'm trying to say is the rural urban are categories that countries use to designate, but there are also certain ways we see culturally, as you were saying, in the US, which goes back to our founding, that there is a rural urban distinction in ideology. And so I think you're definitely on to the unbound liberalism and its effects, and what Kamal has highlighted, the urban-rural sort of dimension, which is really important. So I was wondering if you would like to sort of bring us to bear, how does this deepening inequality perhaps then contribute to sort of adding to or feeding from the nationalism versus the liberalism dynamic you're talking about?
Well, that was one of the arguments I tried to make in the talk, that not just the inequality, the fact that so many people have been badly hurt by hyperglobalization and what's happened in the liberal moment, that, and they think that the state, has failed to take care of them. It's not even worth voting because whether it's a Democrat or a Republican, nobody takes care of us. We're all left behind. I think this is a huge source of our problem. People don't feel like they're part of a cohesive society where the elites are looking out for their welfare. And I think Trump understood this intuitively. He understood that there were just a lot of people out there who were deeply angry about what had happened to the United States and felt like it was no longer their country. They weren't being taken care of. And he appealed very successfully to them. And I think it explains in good part why they remain so loyal to him. They just view him as the only person out there who really cares. And they think that, most other Republicans, the people that Trump defeated in the 2016 primaries, and Democrats for sure, are basically interested in taking care of themselves. And this is why I said, I think that if Joe Biden, wants to get elected, he has to do a lot of what Trump did, and not all of what Trump has done by any means, because I fully understand the problems associated with his presidency. But the fact is that I think the Democrats have to do more. I just also say, just on this urban rural divide, when I talked about the liberal elites, right, I wanted to go to great lengths to make sure that I did not make the argument that they became so captured by liberalism or neoliberalism that they stopped being nationalists. I don't know if you remember, but when I talked about Ronald Reagan and I talked about Margaret Thatcher, I said that they were both nationalists before I talked about their advocacy of neoliberalism. And when I talked about, this transnational elite, this international jet set that's formed, I wanted to go to great lengths to make sure that I made it clear that they remained nationalists. They were not people who still didn't identify as Americans or Germans or what have you. But the fact is that they had formed this other very powerful identity. This other identity was working in ways, right, that undermine nationalism, even though they remain nationalism. And I just tell you this because this is one of the, those sort of tensions in my argument as I was moving forward. that I think sheds a lot of light on this whole phenomenon that's taking place. And basically what I'm saying when I talk about Hillary Clinton, when I talk about Joe Biden, is I'm saying that you can be a good nationalist at the same time you are a good liberal. But you want to understand, I mean, this is kind of the basic theme of my talk, that there's this constant tension between nationalism and liberalism. There's somebody like me who teaches at an elite university, which is thoroughly liberal and is a place I love deeply, and who operates in the academy, which is a thoroughly international environment, which I love deeply, right? I don't want to make the argument that we should go back to some form of hardcore nationalism, right, that lays all of this to waste. That would be horrible. The point that I'm trying to make, however, is that liberalism can go too far and it can begin to undermine nationalism. And when that does, a country gets itself into trouble. So what you're really trying to do here, although I didn't use this language in the talk, I'll use it now, is you're trying to find that sweet spot where you can have thoroughly liberal institutions and you can do X and you can do Y and do Z, which are very liberal policies, but you've got to be constantly aware that you have this nation, you have this nation state, and attending to it and attending to its welfare really matters.
Thank you. I think that's really well, sort of, as I said, the summary, the pithy point of what you've laid out is really finding that the way in which we can manage the differences of inequality and culture as we maintain the core sort of commitments of liberalism, and having the state, and both at the national and at the state levels, sort of work together in a way that we can, so I think I appreciate that, Professor Mearsheimer. Thank you for that wonderful, enlightening sort of
Does
talk.
anybody else want to jump in? I don't see. Okay, on that, let me just see it, make sure. Oh, Elijah, do you have your hand up?
Hello, and thank you very much for a very insightful lecture. I really enjoyed listening to it, and I had a couple of questions about what you mean when you say liberalism. Liberalism in your framework is democracy and market economy sort of fused together. I hope I understood that correctly. And when you think about nationalism, you're saying that nationalism is the most powerful force in the international system, and as evidence of that, you show that the most important unit in the international system is the nation state. But by that logic, because today we virtually have no command economies left. I mean, maybe you can think of Cuba, but I don't know if that would be a very good example. So you have virtually no command economies, which means you have very widespread capitalism. Wouldn't that be akin to your definition of, or your statement that nationalism is the most powerful force because it's all nation states everywhere? If capitalism is so widespread and so powerful, wouldn't that actually make us come to the opposite conclusion, which is that liberalism is actually still very powerful, despite these events in the US and the UK? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the question. You said that I was arguing that liberalism is really all about democracy and market economies. I tried not in my talk to link liberalism with democracy. And although I did link it with market economies, I did that in the sort of second part of my discussion of exactly what liberalism is. And my point is that liberalism is predicated on two basic assumptions about human nature. One is the individualism that's at its core, that we are first and foremost individuals who come together and form social contracts. Think Hobbes, think Locke, right? So it's individualism plus the belief that human beings, despite their significant reasoning capabilities, cannot agree on first principles most of the time. They're just huge differences. So those are the two starting assumptions. And that leads, those two assumptions lead to a world in which there is great potential for conflict among individuals. So my view of liberalism is that it's all about coming up with a political order, a political system that can deal with individuals who don't have real agreement on first principles or questions about the good life, okay? And the liberal solution, in my argument, is all about rights, inalienable rights, tolerance, and a state, right? Those are the three key ingredients of the blueprint, the liberal blueprint for dealing with that potential for individual disagreement and sometimes individual violence. So that's sort of my argument. And then I talked about the market and property rights, a particular set of rights that comes out of that story. And there's no question that that's true. But I would not, and I think you were doing this, you can tell me if I'm wrong, I think you were more or less equating capitalism with liberalism. And I would not do that for 1 second. I agree that, markets really matter all around the world and capitalism matters. Just look at China. I often say to people say, we're now in a new Cold War with China. And it's a lot like the Cold War with the Soviet Union. Well, the big difference between the Soviet Union and China is that the Soviet Union was not a capitalist economic system by any means, right? But the Chinese are capitalists par excellence. Indeed, what makes the Chinese so dangerous from an American point of view is that they may run us off the table economically, technologically, because they are such good capitalists, so to speak. But I wouldn't want to argue, and I'm sure you wouldn't either, that China is a liberal state, because it certainly, if anything, is going in the opposite direction. But I do think markets are part of the liberal story. But just because you have a market economy doesn't mean you're a liberal state. You want to come back at me?
Yes, absolutely. So then if you don't think that democracy is the same thing with liberalism, and you don't think market economies are the same thing with liberalism, but then you talk about this individualism and this universalism, I kind of don't understand what the manifestation of that liberalism is. Because if you take individualism to its logical conclusion, you end up with capitalism. You end up with the idea of private initiative and how that is the way to maximize utility and to bring happiness. The universalist idea and the idea of universal rights, that finds its manifestation in democracy. Everybody has the same rights, everybody gets to express those rights, everybody gets to vote. So I actually don't know what the concrete faces on this liberalism, I mean, what are those in the end?
I'm not sure I can answer your question any more than I did, but I would just come at it from a slightly different angle. I think there are significant overlaps between liberalism and democracy. And I think there's significant overlaps between capitalism and liberalism. I'm not denying that. But I think, as I said to one of the questioners before, I think you can have an illiberal democracy. I mean, again, Viktor Orban is the head of a liberal democracy, and he proudly proclaims that he runs an illiberal democracy. And that just shows you, right, that liberalism and democracy don't always overlap. And I do think that China is a capitalist society, right? But I don't think it's a liberal society. You might argue that there's some overlap, but they're just different. I think you'd have to have much more freedom in a place like China. The relationship between the state and civil society would just have to be fundamentally different than it is today to even come close to qualifying as a liberal democracy.
Professor Mearsheimer, can I pose another question here, since we're now sort of throwing in terms like liberalism and capitalism? I didn't hear the word socialism anywhere in the narrative. So my sense of I guess, let me put on my IR political science 101 hat. Between the debate over critique over the liberalism, we have conservatism and socialism. And socialism as a critique sort of points out that there is a problem with capitalism. And liberalism as a neoliberalism, as you're pointing out, is a way to sort of think about the current moment. And so I guess I'm trying to evoke what maybe the earlier person was trying to get at, is the structural inequalities and the differences are sort of pushed out of the construct of liberalism and nationalism, right? So sort of the individual exists in liberalism, and then sort of we exist as a, sorry. So the social, I'm with you, by the way, on the nationalism part. So I'm also with you on the nationalism of the group identity, and I really appreciate you. So it's the differences that emerge, which are, my sense is, I guess, the inability of liberalism to manage that through capitalism, right? So I guess I'm saying, so the answer you're looking for is to, so I'm going to pause here and so see if there's a way for not to confuse this more, but to get to a central part is your liberalism, nationalism interface allows us to find that political order, right? So, sorry, go ahead.
I really can't answer your question because you're taking me much too far afield.
Yes.
I mean, when you start raising questions like socialism, even bringing, capitalism up and so forth and so on. Right. I mean, I wanted to talk today about liberalism and nationalism and how the two relate to each other. Exactly. We can do a little bit with democracy for sure, and even capitalism, but we have to be careful here that, we don't wander too far afield, because I haven't thought systematically about how socialism relates to liberalism. I just haven't thought about it. There are unfortunately many subjects I haven't thought about, and this is one of them. And I don't want to get in the business of just sort of talking off the top of my head. So I'm going to pass up on this. Folks, I'm going to quit now because it's 2:45. And I think I've gotten all the questions in. I greatly appreciate all the questions. I greatly appreciate everybody coming out today. And as I said early on, this is a wonderful treat for me to win this award. I hope that everybody has a good rest of the day. And for those of you who are far away, I know a few of my friends who are watching are far away. I wish you a good night's sleep. And hopefully we'll cross paths next year in Seattle. And we won't be confined to this crazy situation with a virtual talk and a virtual set of meetings. So anyway, be well and thank you again. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.